There is an early tradition in the Eastern Church, 2nd through 4th, 5th centuries, of the descent of Christ into hell, which of course is spoken of in the first letter of Peter. Christ, after his death, descends into Hades and preaches the gospel. Now, in the Eastern tradition, at least in the majority Eastern tradition at this time, that is understood as Christ descending, destroying the gates of hell and preaching his gospel, declaring his love, and then ascending into heaven, taking with him everyone. So Hades is emptied. Now there's, not everyone agrees with that during this period of time. And in the Western Church, the Latin Church, that was not taught. That was the principal Latin tradition, is only the righteous and the holy are taken out of Hades. But in this one Eastern tradition, hell is emptied. And the one book that elaborates on this at length is by Archbishop, now Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeyev, Christ the Conqueror of Hell. And he discusses this at length both in the Eastern and Western traditions, in the liturgical hymnody of the Orthodox Church, which, when one looks at it, is remarkably Universalist. At least, just if you just read a certain hymn, it would say, well, that sounds like a Universalist text. But of course, it all depends on how you're hearing it. But so there is depths within the Eastern Church that are easily read and can be understood as supporting a universalism. And of course, the principal theologians in the early church who were universalists, and this was a popular belief among Christians from the 2nd century on, and as far as we know, could be going all the way back to the apostles. I mean, the writings of Paul, for example, are easily read as supporting or preaching, declaring the reconciliation of all. But the principal theologians are of apokatastasis, the reconciliation or restitution of all, are Origen in the 3rd century, Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century, St. Isaac the Syrian in the 7th century. So Universalism is really an Eastern conviction. I mean, you can find Western writers, even during this period, like St. Ambrose, who also seems to teach a moderate or hopeful resurrection or salvation of just Christians. But you can, the theme is developed throughout those early centuries. I'd like to read, if I may, from Metropolitan Hilarion's book, a couple passages. First is from Saint Amphilochius of Iconium in the 4th century. And he's speaking again on the descent of Christ into hell or Hades on Holy Saturday. When Christ appeared to Hades, he destroyed its graves and emptied its tombs. He emptied them not by visibly contesting, but by invisibly granting resurrection. He did not unloose anybody, but all were released. He did not talk to anybody, but freedom was announced. He did not call anybody, but all ran after him. For when he appeared as king, the tyrant was humiliated, the light shone and the darkness faded away, for one could see every prisoner free and every captive rejoicing in the resurrection. I mean, just on the face of it, just that text alone would seem to suggest that in the death and resurrection of Christ, one of the consequences is the conquering of death and Satan, and the departed are now released from their captivity and all join Christ in rising to heaven. Then in another passage, St. John Chrysostom, one of the great fathers of the early church, and I just like these two sentences. This place of Hades, dark and joyless, had been eternally deprived of light. This is why the gates were called dark and invisible. They were dark until the Son of Righteousness descended, illumined it, and made Hades heaven. For where Christ is, there also is heaven. That's a quote I used in some of my sermons. I mean, that's a wonderful, where Christ is, there also is heaven. And every Pascha, which is the Orthodox name for Easter, on the vigil, which goes for several hours into Easter, early Easter morning, a homily attributed to St. John Chrysostom is read. It's called the Paschal Homily. Let me just read just a few sentences. Let no one fear death, for the death of our Savior has set us free. He has destroyed it by enduring it. He has despoiled Hades by going down into its kingdom. He has angered it by allowing it a taste of his flesh. When Isaiah foresaw all this, he cried out, "O Hades, you've been angered by encountering him in the netherworld." Hades is angered because it is frustrated. It is angered because it is now captive. It seized a body, and lo, it discovered God. It seized earth, and behold, it encountered heaven. It seized the visible and was overcome by the invisible. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? Christ is risen, and you are abolished. Christ is risen, and the demons are cast down. Christ is risen, and the angels rejoice. Christ is risen, and life is freed. Christ is risen, and the tomb is emptied of the dead. When you hear that on Pascha morning, just in itself, it is a great declaration of universal salvation. Now, the Orthodox don't hear that way necessarily, because most Orthodox believe in eternal damnation, believe that there is a hell and that it will be populated. But just on the face of it, the proclamation of the resurrection of the Lord intimates, I believe, the salvation of all.